Tonight's forum is implementation, getting our act together. We have another eclectic and passionate panel, and I'll introduce our formidable speakers in a moment. But before that, Future Melbourne Network, as usual, would like to express deep appreciation to the sponsors of tonight's event. Those sponsors are Melbourne Conversations, the Victorian Local Government Association, Future Leaders, the fabulous Fed Square, Melbourne Social Equity Institute, and finally Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. Thank you. I'll introduce each speaker fully ahead of their remarks, but they are Kate Roffey, the CEO of the Committee for Melbourne, Dr. Andrew Hollows, CEO of the Victorian Local Government Association, Professor Brendan Gleeson, Director of Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, and my colleague and boss, Editor-in-Chief of The Age, Andrew Holden. The network was created by a group of individuals who cherish this place, but they're concerned that despite various plans, there's a lack of ideas and there's a lack of commitment by policymakers and others to make sure the place has the strong and fair future it should. They want our city to be safe, environmentally clean, sustainable, socially inclusive, and economically robust and successful for all its citizens. All its citizens. Future Melbourne Network's raison d'être is to inform and galvanise a growing discussion about the city's future. It's to demand greater leadership and vision from all parties in this state election year and indeed beyond. Many people have been asking how they can assist the network and how the network can assist you, us, them. An e-book will be produced by Melbourne University covering the issues discussed and the big ideas put forward. The network welcomes your thoughts at the forums and via the website. So, to tonight's topic. Implementation, getting our act together. We know there's much to do. We've looked at transport. We need more options, particularly for people living on our fringes, and our fringes have expanded. What was supposed to be unviolable boundaries of Melbourne have blown out by as much as 50%. That means it's more than 150 kilometres from east to western boundary of Melbourne. That's more than it is from the CBD to Bendigo. We've looked at climate change, and there's much that can be done to reduce the city's emissions and to give people energy options. We've looked at jobs and we've looked at housing, and it's clear we need a wider range of housing options, particularly medium density dwellings close to the city along the transport hubs, but we're still dealing with NIMBYism. We've looked, in other words, at various visions, and now it's time to examine how change might come. So much change comes from the bottom up, from the community. But urban planning by necessity also involves politics and public policy. So, mindful of our looming rendezvous with the ballot box, let's get to our speakers. First up is Kate Roffey. Kate's the CEO of the Committee for Melbourne, and she has great experience across the commercial, government and not-for-profit sectors. She knows about political strategy, and she knows about managing change. She joined the committee in 2012 after 4 years as an executive at Tennis Australia, where, among other things, she helped develop the master plan vision of and secure government funding for the Melbourne Park redevelopment. And we can all thank Kate for that ace. It's a fabulous part of Melbourne, Kate. Before her time at Tennis Australia, Kate was the CEO of Vic Sport, which is the peak body for the Victorian sport and recreation sector. She's also a director of the Melbourne Football Club, which must have been a little trying. As a long-suffering bloody Carlton supporter, Kate, I can say that, I think. She is too a graduate member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Please welcome Kate.
Thank you. Thank you. Assuming you can all hear clearly up the back there, and we did beat Carlton this year, Michael, which was a highlight of the season for us. Look, thanks all for coming along tonight. It is freezing outside as we've hit the cold weather here, but this is a really important issue and a really important topic for us to talk about. For those who don't know about the Committee for Melbourne or what we do, just very briefly, we're an independent based organisation, so we're entirely funded by our member fees, and that gives us a very apolitical and asectorial perspective on what's happening in Melbourne and Victoria, and a very long-term and very big picture vision of what's happening. So what I want to talk a little bit about tonight in my 10 minutes is trying to draw together some of what's been happening over the last of these five previous sessions and this final session. I want to talk a little bit about planning in terms of where we need to be, I think, in developing a plan, how we need to look at delivering a plan, and how we need to protect that plan, because I don't think any one of those things works in isolation. And I don't think unless you have all three of those things working together, are we going to actually genuinely turn up with a visionary plan that is going to drive this city forward into the future. So just talking a little bit in terms of plans, what we have had in the past and what we really do need in the future. I think what we need is a visionary plan. I'm not sure that we really have managed to grasp that yet. We need a long-term plan, and when I talk long-term, I'm talking somewhere to 40 to 70 years. I'm not talking 4 to 8 years. Out there, and we need a multifaceted plan, and really I think this is where we've fallen down in the past, because our plans seem to be about spatial orientation. I want to talk a little bit about jobs. I think this is a huge issue for us. We need to start looking at this much more seriously. What jobs are going to drive this city forward into the future? We really need to sit down and look and assess, and we need to pick some winners. Governments hate doing this, hence the reason the Committee for Melbourne exists, but we can't help energise and innovate great sectors if we don't start to pick ones that are going to drag us upwards in an economic sense. So we really do need to start to pick some winners, and we need to look to business to actually get these sectors moving. This is not a job for government, this is a job for business. They have to start to develop and grow and deliver as sectors. Having said that, government has a very, very important job to do in enabling these sectors, and I think governments are a very important enabler. They may not be great visionary thinkers, but they do have the control over legislation, and if we quickly look to Singapore, who have made some significant steps ahead in this space recently, they actually had a vision which was to become one of the best accounting countries in the world, and their government did the enabling for them. They changed the legislation that needed to be changed. They opened up the doors that needed to be opened up in an international sense, and they have streaked ahead in that space, so it can be done. Urban optimisation, I'm sure we've spoken a lot about that in the past. We're heading towards 8 million people. Where on earth are we going to fit those people in? How are we going to house them? How are we going to provide jobs for them? How are we going to move them around? I think, as Michael just mentioned, if we're not careful, our outer urban boundary will end up on the doorstep of Ballarat very soon, because we continue to grow outwards. We don't like the idea of densification. We have to get over that. We must start to infill, because not surprisingly, all the services sit within the inner city area, because they were the first areas that were developed around Melbourne. So like it or not, we are going to have to infill, and we're going to have to densify. We're going to have to come up with a plan to do that. We can't have people continuing to move out into the western suburbs and not provide them with the infrastructure and connectivity they need to get back to jobs. People and freight movement, we can't go anywhere without speaking about transport at the moment. It is a huge issue for us, particularly public transport, which we find very, very difficult to fund. Somehow we have to start to be more innovative with our funding mechanisms for transport. And we can't forget roads. It's all very nice for us to sit here and say all our money should go to public transport, but don't forget the majority of our freight task is carried by road and will continue to do so. So unless we're prepared to put up with getting our fresh fruit and vegetables 3 or 4 days late, roads have to play an important role in this task. So we need to somehow balance out what is a very limited funding pool between the public transport and the road task in terms of people movement and efficient freight movement. Livability is a key issue for us. Yes, we need a strong economy. We need a city that is internationally competitive, but remaining the world's most livable city is very important for us in a branding sense, because it's one of those things that attracts international headquarters to Melbourne. It's a reason why BHP quite clearly say we are a Melbourne-based city We're a Melbourne-based company, and that's where our headquarters will be, regardless of the fact that most of their work in Australia happens in WA. They want to be here, they want to be a Melbourne-based company. So our arts, our culture, our sporting background, our laneways, those sorts of things are the things that have GM Holden sitting here and saying, as a manufacturing centre we might have closed down, but our research and design innovation centre, which does the designs for Buick in the US, will remain here down at Fisherman's Bend, because people will come to live in Melbourne and we want the best minds in the world working for us. That's why our livability is so important to us. Do not forget how important equity is. We cannot be the world's most livable city for only half the people that live here. And that is a really important point, I think. If we have a much stronger economy, that means we can share the wealth more. But we have to remember to share that wealth. Very, very important. And I think one of those things that we forget to do is incorporate the expertise that's around us when we plan. So there's a lot of great city planners around, there's a lot of great architects, there's a lot of great transport planners, but there's a lot of great people in this audience as well who've got very good ideas. And we could actually learn something from the people out there who are living the experiences day in, day out about what we can do better. We're starting to see a few of these opportunities arise in Queensland recently. Anyone who went onto the state government website and had a crack at trying to balance their books. So they had a little, it was a very good app actually. They had an online app where you could go in and actually try to manage their budget yourself, manage the state finances, and invariably it led to the sale of assets as pretty much the only outcome. But hey, it's pretty much the only outcome they've got left to really balance the budget at the moment. The City of Melbourne here are coming up with a People's Panel. So representatives independently selected by ballot from business and residents in the Melbourne City Council area will have the opportunity to sit with councillors and to sit with the staff at the City of Melbourne and try and deliver a strategic plan going forward, particularly for those big capital spends. Two really important things. One, you might just get some really good ideas that the people who work in the space every day haven't thought about before. But secondly, I can assure you, you will have 50 people who walk out of that forum thinking, my God, it is so difficult to be part of government because I have a limited amount of money over here and I've got 100,000 competing demands for that money on this side. How do I actually pick my priorities? It is not an easy job to be in government. So that's how we developed the plan in very brief 10-minute speak. So now we've got the problem of delivering the plan. And this is, I'm not talking about governance here and what sort of structure that you have. We can argue all day about that. But the key thing is it needs to come with some kind of funding mechanism. Too often we have a plan and we have a great idea and we don't provide any funding to go with that plan. The third thing I just want to mention is protecting the plan. And I talk about this all the time in terms of transcending the political cycle. How do we actually get independent assessment of our priorities away from this political cycle, away from the pork barrel, for want of a better term? I think that we can do this, and in places like Manchester in the UK, for example, they have shown that this can be done, where the politicians themselves said, we are not the best people to make this plan for the long-term future of our city, and we're talking about big funding issues here, things in the billions of dollars. We're not the best people because we do have a political slant. We are interested in the vote, not necessarily what might be the best for the city. So they set aside their right to make those decisions and they gave it to an independent group of people, experts in this space, and they said, you set the priority for us and then we will abide by those priorities that are set. So every time I stand up and talk about this and people tell me that will never happen, we're a democracy, governments once they are voted in have the right to make decisions, I say that isn't the case. I disagree with that. We are the people who live here. This is our city, we're the people who vote, so let's make more of a stand in terms of saying, hang on, that's not good enough, government. It's not good enough for you to get into government and then change something that's been sitting on the priority list for 10 years. So we need to actually take a bit more responsibility by ourselves as the people that live and vote here for making these requirements of government that say, here's the plan and let's stick to the plan. We haven't got the luxury of sitting here and letting this city grow by chance. We will not become a great city, we will not remain a world's internationally competitive city if we just think that this will happen by chance. And we're starting to see this. There's a lot of cities that are getting very close to us in terms of this world's most livable city ranking. There are a lot of cities, a la Singapore, that are starting to take over areas that we should be international powerhouses in. So it's time for us to sit down and take a plan and to have a say as a people who live and work here in what this city is going to be going forward. What is the brand of Melbourne going forward? And I think this start from the people who've had these forums and these discussion groups is a great way for you to start to get involved and get engaged in part of the city's development as a people who live and work here.
I think there'll be some interesting questions coming your way, Kate, about how that might happen. Dr. Andrew Hollows is CEO, as I said, of the Victorian Local Governance Association. Government Association. Governance is very important too. Andrew brings bountiful experience with organisations keen on improving social outcomes. He's been involved in direct service community agencies, including Berry Street, Victoria. He's been involved in state government through the Victorian Department of Human Services. He's been involved in local government through the Shire of Yarra Ranges and the former cities of Northcote and Nunawading. In more recent years, Andrew has worked on national research and policy on housing and homelessness. As Deputy Executive Director of the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, he helped with the creation of a national level Indigenous housing network. Andrew has a PhD in social science. In the best sense of the term, I think it's fair to say he's a policy wonk. He's passionately committed to using evidence and research to create better policies and better practices. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Hollows, Policy Wonk.
Yeah, let me think about the Policy Wonk idea, get back to you on that one. As the CEO of the Victorian Local Governance Association, and as you will see from this presentation, the governance as opposed to local government is the crucial difference. The VOGA, so my great honour to join you here tonight, and I too especially wish to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we're meeting and their elders past and present. As I already know, that the task tonight is to share our big ideas about the planning, governance and financing of Melbourne's development. The focus of my presentation tonight will unashamedly be about governance, and in particular about local governance and making those governance arrangements fit for the purpose for planning for Melbourne. Let me explain these issues. The work of the VOGA is about building local governance, which for us is about the way local councils and community govern together. We are especially interested in what needs to be done to support the work of local councils and also the work of communities so that together they can build strong, inclusive and resilient neighbourhoods. For us, local governance has the following attributes, as noted on the screen. It needs to be responsive to community needs and aspirations, that is effective and equitable in the provision of services and functions, efficient in the use of public resources, and last, and in some sense fundamental, it is democratic in participation and how decisions are made locally about issues that affect local communities. Central to such an understanding of local governance is the important role of local government and how it can advance the interests and needs of a municipality. This, in a nutshell, is the intent of the current Local Government Act. This is a role especially important when talking about planning and the sort of governance needed to drive strategic schemes such as Plan Melbourne. But equally important to the delivery of local governance is the active participation of local communities on issues that affect them, their lives and their communities, be it for a particular neighbourhood, suburb or township. It's clear that residents are increasingly interested in being involved in decisions that directly affect them, where they live and work, and it means connecting with the issues that matter to people in their daily lives, and also to connect these issues to the big picture of policy and planning. Hence the focus of the work of the VOGA on both councils and communities. To focus only on one aspect is not sufficient, both are required. To govern effectively, the different groups responsible for governance at a community level need to work in collaboration. This includes councils, higher tiers of government, NGOs and other entities which influence the delivery of local governance. It also means developing local governance arrangements that support a collaborative approach between councils and communities to determine how priorities are made and how to deliver those. But the circumstances in which local governance is exercised, and by extension, the context of meeting the planning pressures enunciated by Plan Melbourne, are both changing and confronting. The current period is one of uncertainty for effective local governance, such as demographic shifts, including population ageing, growth and decline, increasing mobility, all placing pressure on councils to ensure services are responsive to community needs and are within the capacity of local government to deliver. How to maintain the livability and amenity of neighbourhoods and the vibrancy of civic life are ongoing concerns, giving new urgency about problems of environmental degradation and seemingly intractable social disadvantage, those of the wicked problem variety. Councils are contending with these changes through fostering local economic activity, social connectedness, and through planning and providing infrastructure. However, the capacity to fully address these issues and implement solutions is severely constrained. One of those constraints is financial sustainability, which is an immediate pressure on local governments, affecting some councils more than others. Critically, without the ability to deliver on community needs, local government's capacity to work together with communities is severely compromised. Effective local governance requires councils to be financially sustainable. In an increasingly public sphere, councils are also required to collaborate with other tiers of government, state and federal. But around that is a congested space also of emerging innovations in community level governance, be it community banking on one hand and new governance bodies such as the Metropolitan Planning Authority on the other. And certainly I'm keen to come back to that as an issue during the Q&A session. This all demands clear cooperation and partnership. But in some sense, the fundamental issue here around good local governance and the ability to deliver on good planning is the public perception of councils in general and government too through the democratic deficit. Community expectations are changing and answering these require democratic processes that are transparent, inclusive and support wide participation. These are then the circumstances in which planning issues for Melbourne must be located, both the upside of the potential and necessity of local governance, but also tempered by the downside of a co-influence of factors that make local governance, that is, the role of local councils governing with their communities, a hard act to deliver. Because without effective engagement at the local level, levels of cynicism within the community about government will persist. And community support and active participation in the activities of local government is needed if local governance is to be vibrant and strong. To meet this challenge, it brings me to my second main point. Local governance must be fit for purpose in dealing with planning issues in Melbourne. The key challenge is, how do we support local governance remains democratic while supporting the equitable development of Melbourne as a metropolitan city? And when I refer to Melbourne, it's Melbourne in total. Don't forget the suburbs. To think these matters through, I've identified a number of questions which perhaps we can follow up during the course of this evening. For instance, how can we balance the needs of metropolitan-wide planning with local community interests? In other words, how do we strike a balance between metropolitan, sub-regional and municipal level governance? Subsumed within this question is consideration of the nature of governance arrangements to implement regional-wide decisions, but again, certainly not at the loss of democratic decision-making. Another question, how do we encourage and support local councils on the issue of ongoing collaboration on shared planning issues, specifically at a sub-regional level? How do we ensure a legitimate and respectful role for local government that is respected by and works in effective collaboration with the state government, and where relevant, with the feds? How to preserve the legitimacy of local government as the immediate tier of government, not the last, the immediate tier of government, in the context of the work of governance bodies such as the MPA. And even more fundamental, how do you foster trust between local councils and communities about planning issues, service design and service delivery? And again, that fraud issue, how to tap into the views and perspectives of the silent majority as opposed to the so-called noisy minority. And a really critical one in some ways, how to raise the tone of the conversation about planning, boosting the skills and confidence of councillors, and using local mechanisms to support and inform, and hopefully to raise the tone of the conversation with community. And quite a fundamental one for the VLGA, how to balance our local level, the legitimate but sometimes divergent interests of residents, ratepayers and local citizens, especially when you wear all the three hats at the same time. How do you actually negotiate that dichotomy? And last but not least, how to ensure outcomes that do not simply reinforce the current spatial, economic and social divide that already categorises Melbourne. So, by way of conclusion, it is necessary that any discussion about planning starts with the issue of local governance and the role of local government and its communities governing together, a fundamental starting point. It is clear that local governance is no longer, if it ever was, the sole preverse of local government. It is increasingly the domain of a wide range of different organisations and networks, bringing different but ideally complementary perspectives together. And certainly there's a key role here for councils in enabling and promoting local governance broadly defined. But as discussed, if we are to adequately respond to the big picture issues outlined in Plan Melbourne, this requires governance arrangements that are fit for purpose. That is, fit to the task of supporting local governance, but also meeting the overarching needs of good planning at a metropolitan level. Critically, any governance arrangements must deliver local outcomes which, as I mentioned previously, are responsive to community needs, effective in the delivery of services, efficient in the use of public resources, and most importantly, are democratic by supporting local decision-making. These indeed are the challenges, and this is the work of the Victorian Local Governance Association. Thank you.
It's a tricky one, Andrew, isn't it? That balance between corporate hygiene and commercial in confidence negotiations at the community level, and I'll be interested to see what sort of questions come on that. Professor Brendan Gleeson is the director of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, I should say. Brendan joined Melbourne University in 2012 as Professor of Urban Policy Studies. Before that, he was the Deputy Director of the National University of Ireland's National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis. And before that, he set up the Urban Research Program at Griffith University and was its inaugural director. Professor Gleeson makes scholarly contributions in urban and social policy, environmental theory and policy, and is a regular commentator in newspapers, television and radio. He's the author or editor of 12 books, 3 of which have won national and international prizes. He's authored also numerous journal articles. He researches urban planning and governance, urban social policy, disability studies and environmental theory and policy. His latest book, The Urban Condition, has just been published by Routledge. Brendan was the inaugural recipient of the John Ironmonger Award for Writing on Public Policy Issues, and he was leading to the publication of his seminal tome, Australian heartlands, making space for hope in the suburbs. Please welcome Professor Brendan Gleeson.
Thanks, Michael. Take a note, provide shorter biogs, I think. So apologies for inflicting that on you and all the rest of you as well. Well, thanks. It's a relief, actually, to speak at this forum. I was just thinking that earlier. My last two public talks this year have been in Europe, in Amsterdam earlier in the year, and then in Heidelberg in Germany week before last. And I can tell you that speaking as an Australian on environmental matters has been a somewhat excruciating experience for me. Evoking interest, yes, but also scepticism and, to my dismay, some hostility as well. The influential French public intellectual Bruno Latour has recently invoked us, Australia. We're a long way from the thought salons of Paris, and I don't think Australia's featured much, if at all, in Latourian, very influential Latourian social commentary and theory, but in a widely discussed address to the Royal Academy in Copenhagen recently, which is a very major European public lecture, he's discovered us. He speaks of the Australian syndrome, and it's not a happy syndrome, it's a disorder. Our national disorder is described as, quote, voluntary sleepwalking towards catastrophe. Is that unfair? Surely it doesn't apply to our planning efforts, which by definition, planning oppose the idea of sleepwalking into change. Does Plan Melbourne betray this alleged Australian syndrome? I might actually throw in and add also that as part of this rich and somewhat unsettling European experiences, I shared a train journey on the way to Heidelberg from Frankfurt with a guy who turned out to be a leading player, a private consultant in the national effort that Germany is undertaking in terms of energy transition to renewable energies. And he shared this view, this Australian, what is going on over there? Why are you so intransigent on climate change? And this is not coming from a kind of socks and sandals or particularly progressive perspective. I think he'd be quite conservative in many ways. But just a different national mindset or outlook. German Sicherheit, security. How could you not, given the manifest threats and failures around the energy we've been using, how could you not now as a nation make that transition? Very curious. So if the leading edge of potential catastrophe is the climate emergency, and I think that's the best way to describe it, that is now manifest in our cities, can we say that we're doing better than sleepwalking in metropolitan planning, to bring it back to this forum? Are we getting our act together to invoke the theme for tonight for this dramatic play that's already breaking on us? And I don't think so. We have plenty of resources though. We have the excellent work by my Monash colleagues, Nigel Tapper and his collaborators, that has been modelling and mapping for example, urban heat stress for Australian cities resolved to local spatial scales. And I'd urge you all to consult these. You just Google this stuff, or I can provide you with a link or reference afterwards. You can look at these online maps of Australian cities and look at this geography of vulnerability. And also I'd urge you to consult the 2013 report behind these. Its title was A Spatial Vulnerability Analysis of Urban Populations During Extreme Heat Events in Australian Capital Cities. CSIRO's done a lot of work in this area too. So a lot of very definitive work has been done that should be used as decision support and planning material. It should be integral to our metropolitan planning preparations for change, but it is not. So in the next few minutes, I want to speak just broadly, just to bring back on topic, briefly and broadly to the chapter. There was an e-book coming out of this that was mentioned. I want to speak to a chapter on implementation that's being prepared for that volume that'll emerge from this series. Crystal Legacy of RMIT University has been the lead author and very much the thought leader for that chapter. which includes contributions by myself and Jago Dodson, also of RMIT University. And that ebook, Melbourne, What Next, will record many of the contributions of speakers and authors to this forum. Will be freely available from our institute and cross-linked to our colleagues at the Social Equity Institute. Its authors are Carolyn Weitzman, Alexander Sheko and myself. So, just drawing from that work a few squibs or thoughts or desiderata, whatever you like, on implementation, drawing particularly, acknowledging the thought leadership in this work of Crystal Legacy. The good ideas are hers and the mistakes are mine. So, public participation, especially in plan making, is critical to successful and to efficient planning and effective planning. It's not an enemy of or a cost to the planning system. The cities overseas and in Australia that have enjoyed most success in plan implementation, which we're thinking about tonight, are those that saw civic participation as a system plus, not as a negative. That's not a new point. The cause of participatory planning has been debated and prosecuted for decades with varying success, but the matter is especially acute in our contemporary times, overshadowed as they are by broad community anxiety about social and economic change and the new and very disconcerting scales of ecological risk that we've ascended to, if you like, especially climate warming. Now, in these troubled times, I think any major social direction or statement of social direction, like a metropolitan plan, any such major statement of direction that discounts the necessity of democratic deliberation is very likely to fail, and probably only after much costly conflict and pushback. Now, in these complex, also fluid, cosmopolitan times, exciting times, but quite cosmopolitan and increasingly in our social and cultural makeup and our global connectedness, the ideal of community consensus has never at once been so difficult, but at the same time so necessary to attain. State elections are certainly important moments in the broad policy cycle where, broad brush alternatives are put to the public and decided upon, but they aren't a substitute for public deliberation and participation in planning decision making. And I think for a very long time, our metropolitan planning system has been too driven by the vagaries and short-termism of the electoral process. I think the planning system needs its own dedicated circuit of civic conversation and decision making, particularly in setting the planning vision for Melbourne and making fundamental decisions about its structure. Part of this, no major urban project should be conceived and decided outside the core processes of planning. As the late Paul Mees argued persuasively, planning by road agency is not metropolitan planning. And we have, and we're not alone in having too many examples of planning decisions being made outside what should be a planning process. Any major public policy decision that affects the fundamental shaping of Melbourne should be included to and indeed central to the planning process. It must not be handed fait accompli to planning. Comprehensive planning is the ideal, bit of an old beige concept or term, but I think we should still hold to. Comprehensive in a couple of ways. First, involving thoroughgoing civic deliberation of metropolitan visions and also of the pathways to their realisation. And second, meaning integrated planning across the full urban management and service spectrum. And that necessitates collaboration between the agencies responsible for the social, environmental and physical development of Melbourne. Now, we've had a lot of experiments with integrated planning in Victoria, as have other jurisdictions, and we simply need to recommit to the cause of this rather difficult but necessary approach to planning. I think comprehensive planning also means full realisation of the metropolitan vision, whatever vision we express, we can debate that, and certainly not just the select parts that reflect state funding priorities and or the preferences of powerful lobbies. Now, environmental and social goals, though typically included as leading metropolitan objects, are too often left without meaningful commitment or mechanisms for implementation. Social and spatial equity of outcomes of urban development has also been a leading object of planning throughout its history. Arguably, however, commitment to equity in Melbourne's planning system has been diminished and should be restored. Equity takes many dimensions and forms. One broad cut that deserves our attention has just been mentioned previously is the huge and largely unsupported burden that our outer municipalities are facing or bearing in the face of record population growth. Positive, not regulatory planning. I'll just bring this to an end, thanks for that. We need to think about the agencies and vehicles and creative mechanisms, including taxing and financing mechanisms that can be used to achieve, in a positive way, planning objects and not simply trying to plan Melbourne through regulation. I would draw attention to some of the more successful vehicles that have been deployed in other jurisdictions, like the Brisbane Housing Company, which is jointly owned by the Queensland State Government and Brisbane City Council, as a creative mechanism or vehicle for achieving, in a positive way, metropolitan outcomes. So just to finish, I wanted to say that the creation of the Metropolitan Planning Authority, we're arguing in the chapter, is a very welcome development. State government has been congratulated for that. It's to be further applauded, I think, for hypothecating funding to that. The challenge will really, and this is just to finish, will be to further the development of that body in a variety of ways. First, it should have carriage for plan making and for ensuring integrated planning by state agencies, and it will need to be empowered to do that. But second, and just as importantly, it should be tasked and equipped to foster and maintain a meaningful civic conversation about planning objects and strategies. In short, its participatory and deliberative functions need to be better defined and strengthened, and perhaps that's conversation we can take into the election. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Brendan. You might have seen the Age's editorial this morning, "We Feel Your Pain." The headline was "Carbon Tax Repeal Shames Our Nation." Perhaps we should have written it before you went. Our final speaker stands behind that editorial. Andrew Holden is our Editor-in-Chief. Andrew became Editor-in-Chief of The Age 2 years ago. It meant a return to his home after spending a dozen years in New Zealand. Among his roles there, he was the editor of the press in Christchurch for 4.5 years. That included the major earthquakes that devastated the city. Andrew has more than 30 years' experience in journalism, from daily newspapers to community titles to magazines in 3 countries. I know somewhat well, and I know intimately, just how much change Andrew has been involved in. Mainstream media companies are going through what we could call an extraordinary transition. The Age is at the heart of our community, and so Andrew cares deeply about the issues Future Melbourne Network has been ventilating tonight and in the past few months. Beyond that, his experience in Wellington has given him wrenching and valuable insights into the needs of an urban community. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I was hoping you were going to give a 2-word description of the Equal of Policy wonk. I was looking forward to seeing what that might have been and tucking that one away for your performance review in a couple of months. Can I start by, first of all, paying my respects to the elders past and present of the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Like those who've spoken before, I've been thinking about a massive topic, but in the end concentrating on people and where do people fit within this? How do we get Jack and Jill of Wheelers Hill involved in the future of Melbourne and how we plan it? And reading a little bit about the 5 sessions, the 4 before this and the 5 here, of course, one of the things that we do each night at the end, which is go up the back and fill out a post-it note and leave a few ideas, triggered, of course, a very direct memory from Christchurch. And it, in that particular case, took a crisis to bring the community together to think about the planning of its future and the city that they would want rebuilt. And hopefully in Melbourne we won't need a crisis to actually do it in this manner. But Bob Parker launched an extraordinary event there where they effectively took over a building of the size of the Hisense Arena and turned it into an opportunity for the community to come along, look at some maps about the city, read about the particular issues that it had, the transport, where they couldn't build, where they could rebuild, and basically put their ideas up in a whole lot of boards, a whole lot of post-it notes. The power of doing something in this manner, and again the speakers before me have talked about this, getting that community engagement, that community involvement, is that it gave great power to the City Council and the national government there to actually make some remarkably bold decisions. One of them is to take a series of city blocks and buy them from the business owners and turn them into a park on the edge of town. Conceive, if you will, the entire block from Spencer Street to Spring Street being Lonsdale to Latrobe, completely bulldozed and turned into a park. And that's exactly what they're doing in Christchurch in terms of the scale of that city. So I think if you look at something of this kind, the buy-in, that ability, as the others have talked about, to look a long way ahead, 30, 40 years, to say this is the sort of city we want, will be energised by a very simple process that can start with a post-it note. So I'll propose to start with, I'm going to make three proposals tonight, is that Melbourne's municipal councils be required to hold at least one such session every 2 years. Though an option might be that they hold 4, one every 6 months, in a particular part of their community or on a particular issue, and involve people and get them to come along and propose their ideas. The second thing I wanted to touch on is how do we know that we spend our money wisely? And Kate mentioned this before, and here's our particular story. This fantastic idea, this fascinating idea of a citizens' jury to come along and help the City Council decide what might happen. As you can see, they're 43 everyday Melburnians, making up a people's panel, being provided by an independent research group, the New Democracy Foundation. Interestingly, a little bit further in that story, you won't see it, Darebin Council is also having a look at this idea. You might think, of course, that the councillors should be doing that. After all, that's why we elect them, isn't it? To know exactly what we want and to come and make these decisions. So it would be remiss of me in saying that I think this is a fantastic idea and we do it, not to reiterate the Age's opinion that we have too many councils. For once, we actually agree with Jeff Kennett, and that's an extreme rarity, I can assure you of that. But when he reduced them many years ago, we in fact believe we should take it further, and I'm going to throw out the number. I think Melbourne should be reduced to 6 councils. That would be plenty. Then we can have citizens' juries to work within those much larger municipal areas to drive through the spending of the particular money, and I think we would have far more effective planning across the city if we were to do that. The third element that I want to touch on, and the last, is who gets the credit. In this particular case, the exhibition buildings, lots of lovely names there, lots of sirs, lots of honourables. You'll notice that absolutely nobody whose taxes paid for that building gets a mention here. It's always the top worthies. And you, like me, will walk around town and you'll walk over bridges and you'll walk into parks and you'll walk into buildings, and it'll be the Premier and it'll be the Minister for Planning and it'll be the local mayor, and everybody gets a wonderful name there. You and I never get there. We're never going to be asked to cut a ribbon. So here's a proposal, and yet I know many of you have been in a similar circumstance that I have, where my older kids' primary school in Christchurch needed to raise a lot of money to build a new activity centre. They offered reasonable amounts, $250, $500. Within that centre, you can now have a little plaque with your name on it that gives you the credit for having been part of this. So what if we made it that, in fact, our citizens could identify a particular project that they wanted to fund, get the land from the council, decide what the idea might be for that particular park, put the money in, get the credit, put their name on the park, so that for all their families, futures, their grandkids and all the rest of it, they can see what Grandpa did in their particular community. And while we're thinking about funding, and I'll finish on this one, of course, we know private-public partnerships are all the rage, but of course we'd be silly, wouldn't we, not to say that the world is changing rapidly. And one of the most dynamic ways of raising funds for ideas that no government's ever going to support, no commercial business wanting an ROI and all the various business case requirements is ever going to go there, but crowdfunding sites now have the ability to put a proposal out to the world to say, here's an idea. Here's a movie I want to make, here's an album I want to record, here's an artwork I want to do, here's a park I want to rejuvenate, here's a bicycle path I want to build, here's a connection that I want to do in my community. Who amongst you will help me fund this? And I'll give you the credit as well. So the final solution that I would propose is that we let the community choose the project, fund it, guide it, and get the credit. Thank you very much.
There's a question over here on the left, first up. Thank you.
It's a question for Andrew Holden. I'm Jill from Wheelers Hill. Andrew, I really like that idea of the sticky notes and asking the community, both adults and children, to bring forth their ideas. And no doubt there are very many creative ones. But I'd really like to know what was the follow-on from that, and how did you get back to all of those people who contributed ideas? How did you get back to them if their ideas were actually listened to, and so that you involved them in a feedback process so that they felt valued with their ideas, because that's the best way to encourage ideas to keep coming forth. Thank you.
There wasn't a feedback process as such in the end, or not individually, because we're talking tens of thousands of people took part in this. But essentially what the council took on themselves was to analyse every single post-it note, feed it into a database, add them up so that the top ideas kept coming to the top. And then that informed the council's overall plan for the rebuild of Christchurch, so that people could go on. It was quite a substantial document that they could read according to the different elements, the different themes that were part of that public involvement. And people could see that maybe my idea wasn't one of the top ideas, but I could at least see what the majority of people said. So it had an extraordinary buy-in. We're talking here about, it was one of the best insured countries in the world, so we're talking about a $30 to $40 billion rebuild of a city of around 350,000 people. So it's a 30 to 40 year project. But at least now they know what the way ahead is, even if it's going to take that much time to rebuild it.
Could I perhaps ask Andrew Hollows, who, how do you feel about that in terms of hygiene?
I was intrigued by the comment about and the reference to the People's Panel, because certainly we provided comment on that particular story, and we're quite keen that both the City of Melbourne were looking to do the community budgeting process, and certainly City of Darebin as well has been doing some really insightful work there as well. I guess I'm still struggling with the idea of how you can get the balance right between having the hands-on citizen participatory democracy piece, but also playing to the strength of the elected representatives of local council as a tier of government. And I worry if we start to detract from the role of councils as a tier of government and as a tax raiser and as a provider of many, many services, and where you get the balance right there. But certainly the view of the VLGA is that there is a need to both broaden and deepen the nature of the participation more broadly around a range of issues, not just planning, but a range of issues more broadly, and looking at ways and means where you can actually bridge pretty much what's a trust deficit. There's a strong trust deficit between councils and community and all tiers of government, truth be told. So certainly in principle keen on the idea, but again, how do you actually get this happening in practice and making sure that you do actually get access to, the silent majority?
Kate, do you think it requires a catastrophe?
No, I don't say catastrophe. I say a coalition of the willing, more so. So I think in that space we need to get government, politicians, away from thinking that any time there's public consultation or consultation from people outside of politics that it's negative. It can be a very positive thing, and in fact very, very good ideas, and part of the committee's brief is that we're not here to point the finger at government and say you're not doing a good enough job, it's your job to do it. We're actually here to say here's a problem, and collectively from our membership and the great knowledge that we have within that space to say, and here's a solution. And I think if you go with good solutions to problems, governments welcome you with open arms, because they have so many things on their plates that many times they are quite happy to accept what is a good and sensible solution, so long as it's a good and sensible solution. And to answer the questions of how do you make sure every single person has a say, it is never going to happen. We will never get anything done, but we need to consult and engage, and then at some point in time there needs to be some entity or somebody that says, well, based on as much information as we can gather, we are going to move forward in this direction. So we're always going to have to, even in my organisation, I'm the CEO, I can have as much consultation as I want, but in the end I have to make the decision because I'm the one who has to live and die by it.
I don't want to be provocative about this, but and it was before your time, but Docklands is intimately associated with the Committee for Melbourne. Do you think that's a success story?
I do, actually. I think if you look at it now, you'll see that many businesses are moving down there. Yes, it's got some major problems, but you don't... Same with MyKey, everybody talks about it, oh, it's a disaster. Well, if you change your whole IT system at one of the biggest companies in Australia, it's not going to work spot on the day you walk in to switch your computer on. There's always going to be bugs in the system. I think it's the same down at Docklands, but I think it really is starting to come to the fore as a place people want to actually move their businesses down. There's nice new floor plates. They are actively building their libraries and starting to realise that open space down there is important. And I think Fisherman's Bend, Egate, all these new developments can be the same if we plan sensibly. And I think that's the big problem at the moment. We're in a real danger of these things just starting ad hoc with a building here and a school not in the zone, and that's why planning is so important.
Brendan, what do you think about the crowdsourcing idea?
It's probably the area of my least expertise tonight, is crowdsourcing. I think it's good that Andrew's playing provocateur and helping us to think about some of these. Well, they're not novelties, they're major innovations, I guess, in social behaviour and the financing of projects and work and innovative work at a certain scale. But and I accept that, and I accept that argument. We should bring that into our thinking. But I'm inevitably drawn back to some of these very major questions that we have around public financing and some of the manifest problems we've had with public-private partnerships, for example. Gone wrong. I'm persuaded by some of the arguments of Ken Davidson's been putting. We seem to be signing up and recommitting to some of those errors again. So not to discount that, but I'm also very concerned that we bring those major financing questions into play in planning.
We've got a question over here, then we've got one up the back.
Rob Duncan. In seminar 3, Carol and Pincott quoted Buckminster Fuller saying, to change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. I suspect we're all feeling frustration at the slow and ineffective pace of progress in the face of the urgent challenges for change required for future-proofing our city. There seems to be adequate understanding of what needs to happen, but the paralysis in progressing toward a more resilient future. Could this be due to established governance and organisation structures where tasks and responsibilities are segmented and fragmented between and even within organisations, with a focus on specialist elements rather than the whole coherent agreed objective? Place-based models that were foreshadowed a decade ago stimulated some highly successful demonstration projects, including one I was involved with in Bendigo, but the conventional structures based around segmented specialisation prevail. Is it time for new forms of management that focus on achieving comprehensive outcomes rather than cobbling together disparate players who often put their agency, profession or work unit ahead of contributing to truly integrated outcomes? As suggested by Bucky Fuller, perhaps this requires a new model that makes the current incremental business as usual governance structures obsolete.
Okay, who's up for that?
Brendan in particular, I think.
Few.
The question was? I think let me not respond without respect to you putting in a very fulsome way, I think, the necessity, as you see it, of us making some great stride or transition to a new model, and in particular a new model for making Melbourne sustainable and resilient. I couldn't agree with you more, and I said such words about integrated planning, and freighted in that is the necessity of overcoming silos and all those, the well-worn arguments, and lots of novel thinking about how to take a more holistic approach to planning. But what do we have in front of us right now? I guess I would just offer one thought, and it's not quite on what you're arguing, but contemplating all this from afar a week or two ago, thinking Australia, about to repeal the carbon tax and so on and so forth. But I think that political sentiment, which I don't think is only of the current government, I think it's in places politically elsewhere as well, I have faith that it's out of sync with a more complex and cosmopolitan Australia that's not going to stand for that. So I'm hoping that the transition which we need to make and the new models and thoughts that we need, there will be an insistence upon that, hopefully before we come to some kind of crisis like a dreadful summer which results in lots of deaths and things like that.
Does anybody else want to have a...
Thank you for the statement and the question, because I think, unfortunately, we lost along the way a lot of those place-based experiments about 10 or 15 years ago. Even though the threshold there is very high in terms of getting a heap of community agencies, let alone government agencies, working together. And certainly the nirvana of trying to pool funding across multiple government departments, I've never seen anything quite work yet in Australia in achieving that. I guess what I want to point to still is that in some ways the game changer, to use that term, is already occurring, is already emerging, is that at a local level there's a lot of players there. There's NGOs becoming far more sophisticated, social entrepreneurs, there's councils, many of them very innovative, state governments playing a role at a local level, federal government through Department of Social Security, DITO, community banking movement over here, so on and so forth. So there's a very congested space there already, and I think realising that there's a whole heap of players who are having a large impact on community and local governance is already happening, and so how do you actually coordinate those? But critically, how do you ensure there's still the transparency, the accountability and the democratic piece? And I think certainly local councils in many respects are best placed to play that enabler role.
Kate, do you want to talk about the idea and a democracy deficit, perhaps?
Democracy deficit. I think this is really interesting, and not so much a democracy deficit, but I am very interested in this thing that we always look for a new structure. Yeah. So we miss, I think we get stuck in this, mortar and brick sort of discussion instead of actually saying what is the principle of what we're trying to do here. And if I can use Andrew's issue of the councils and the number of local councils here, I'm guessing that the main issue is we need a bigger strategic plan. That's why we think we need a bigger council. But we have an excellent example in the north-eastern area of this greater metropolitan city where 6 or 7 of the councils out there have come together and they actually are developing their own bigger picture strategic plan for infrastructure and jobs and housing, and they're taking that to federal government and they're taking that to state government, and they're getting a long way down the track in terms of developing this because they have a coalition of the willing who have come together and have said let's set aside our rubbish collections and our things that local councils have to do or we're going to be very unhappy as residents. Leave that structure and how that works. That's a big job to change that structure, but what the principle of what we're trying to do is a better strategic big picture vision for our sector here. And so they've come together and they've done that without having to worry about all the nuts and bolts bits down there, and they're making great progress. So maybe we need to start, instead of thinking the silos and things are wrong, which they are, but instead of having to change the silo or move the silo around, let's just change the thinking in the silo and actually say, okay, let's have the right principle of what we're trying to achieve here and bring the thinking together. Maybe the silos don't actually matter so much then.
Andrew, you know about silos. Do you want to...
I think that's a really interesting perspective, and I think I'll throw a little bit of Pollyanna in here because, I was away from the city, apart from fleeting visits, for nearly a dozen years. And I still drive around the city and I'm still astonished by the things that have been built that I didn't know about. Convention centre and a new Hilton hotel down the back of Jeff's shed, and I had not the faintest idea. It wasn't until I had to go and do something there recently. Docklands. There's some amazing things get built in this city that I think it's a little bit easy for us to sit back and and feel nothing's happening at all. So I'm really pleased to hear that. What worries me is some of the big picture ones like the East-West link get captured in this big sense of the political cycle. Is this coming state election a judgment on whether the East-West link is right or wrong? It probably won't be at the end of the day, quite frankly. I don't think most people are going to vote in this election actually thinking about East-West link at all. And yet that seems to be the thing that drives so much of the decision making, or the way the decision is made. We've got to make it, we're going to ram it through, and we're going to defy the protesters, as opposed to building an opportunity to say, well, what if we sat down with those communities in that area and said, you tell us whether it makes a lot of sense to have a freeway dumping tens of thousands of cars onto suburban streets. Is that the smartest way we can actually solve the traffic problem at the end of the Eastern Freeway? I suspect they'd have come up with something far better and without the political crisis that we have around the building of a tunnel.
One of the themes that's come through these events has been the conflict or the tension between the political cycle and the need for a longer term vision. I believe we have a question. We'll go there and then we'll go in here.
Put a very simple question to the panel. We could probably quite easily in this city organise the expertise necessary to develop better systems for planning the city. What are the primary obstacles, in your opinion, to that? If even one obstacle each to the idea of better planning systems? What's getting in the way? What's stopping us from doing it?
Andrew, this end, do you want to go first?
These guys know this better than me.
No, this Andrew.
Good.
Maybe I can defer to the Honourable Professor Gleeson first, and I'll over my response.
I like that. All right. Well, speaking as someone who's been away from the city for even longer than you have, Andrew, sorry, my observation on what are the institutional and political blockages to something better, right in and of the moment, the first one would be being far too much, there appears to be far too much prerogative from the executive in planning, and ministerial interference and call-in, and seems to be an extraordinary scale. And I think that's much more corrosive and damaging to the planning system than we ordinarily realise, outside whether the particular call-ins are right or wrong. And also, after having been away for a long time, I don't think I've ever seen the state agencies, including in the planning space, and I'm not critical of the people in them, but it's such a low ebb in terms of energy, innovative potential and resourcing and commitment. So I think those two areas have to be redressed with some urgency.
Kate?
Look, I'll throw one out there that you're not expecting. Voters, I think, are a big problem. I think at the moment we are very hung up in this political world of trying to gather votes come election time, and that's because I think we as voters are quite fickle in which side of the fence we're going to fall on, so it gives politicians this sense that they have to try and make decisions. And I think, in Andrew's point, we will not see an election like the one we're about to see, where I do really think that a huge amount of the votes will be driven on the roads versus rail debate there. And so we now have governments scrambling to make decisions which are billions of dollars. And to put this in context, I spoke on a panel, or I spoke with a six-term councillor from Vancouver, and he said 1 million seconds is about 2 weeks. 1 billion seconds is 32 years. So just put that in context of how much money we're talking about when we're talking about $16 billion projects, and we are having these decisions made as rushed decisions in order to try and gather votes come election time. That is just wrong. So we need to somehow get this decision making on these huge, very costly city-shaping issues, and these are very important for our productivity. We will not be, I can assure you, a city of 8 million people if we do not do something about our public transport system very soon, because people will not want to live here. It'll take me 3 hours to commute from Glen Laverley to the CBD to get to work. So these sorts of things are really going to have an impact on our future, and they're issues that we're not addressing because they're stuck in this very short-term political cycle. So somehow we need to get them out of that cycle.
That's a good governance segue, Andrew.
Thank you for that. I was actually going to suggest that the curious history of big picture strategic planning, not just in Melbourne but beyond, has been you can plan to your heart's content, but unless you can provide the incentives around the direction of labour markets and housing markets, which are very powerful forces. You can plan to your heart's content, but unless you can actually line up some of those bigger picture issues and hopefully to overcome, the amazing spatial divide we have in the city. You can map it around income, you map it across who goes to private schools and who doesn't, you map it against voting intentions, housing affordability. Unless you can get the cogs of labour markets and housing markets working in sync in terms of your broader planning objectives, ain't gonna happen.
Andrew, how's the Age going to evaluate the bite and the weight of the transport argument ahead of the election?
We've been pretty clear on the need for the investment in public transport, but quite frankly, investment in both. The element I'd throw in is it's a political but a social argument, and that is this concept that public debt is evil. I get the GFC, and I get the atrocious levels of debt in particular countries in Europe, what happened in America, but it didn't happen in Australia because of far better governance and far better financial management. And yet we seem to be paralysed at the moment that, oh my God, we can't possibly borrow the money we need for this city-changing investment in public transport. So we frantically go looking for some private equity that might come in and charge exorbitant rates when don't we need to sit back and go, actually, there's a value to public debt. We don't have overwhelming levels of public debt in this country. Victoria certainly doesn't. What's the smart investment? That's the one that puzzles me, I've got to say.
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons we came through the GFC so well is we went into it with such low debt, but it has left us in a good position to use that as a funding mechanism for intergenerational assets with record low interest rates. It's a very interesting argument. There's a question over here.
Thanks, panel. It's been great to hear your perspectives. I'd like to pick up a few themes that you picked up on, and that is related to a talk that I went to this morning with Jennifer Keysmark from the City of Toronto. And what she said was that the last election, the government went to people and said that we want to spend $15 billion on public transport to improve public transport in Toronto, and they were voted in with an overwhelming majority, and there isn't a situation where you've got governments that are not fully elected. So my question to you is, how do we get our elected officials to have the courage to bring in the collective wisdom of crowds to request that we spend the money that we need? Last year, the Auditor General said we had a $36 billion underspend in our growth areas, so we are very underspent. I'd just like to ask you what you think about putting out there, is the government courageous enough to ask the wisdom of crowds to vote for them to spend the money that's required to produce the outcomes that we've been talking about?
In my view of politics, is there are two things that drive them, and the most overwhelming is fear. And I think, let me throw in a little bit of political speculation. You won't see it written up in an Age editorial. Clive Palmer will contest in this state election, and if he starts polling a significant level, and either of the two major parties conceive that they may have to go into coalition with Clive, that will be fear. That will be a crisis. And at that point, they may be bold enough to do exactly what you say and come out with some real visionary leadership.
Brendan?
Look, I wasn't here at the last state election, but my understanding was that it was, if not completely, but largely, or at least partly decided by community concern around public transport in Melbourne, played a leading role in it, and the current government made all sorts of commitments to system enhancements which it hasn't implemented. I think I'm just stating the facts. So, you cite the Toronto example, but the government we have here was elected on the basis of a fairly serious set of promises for investment in public transport. I think our problems are, well, they're not alone, but we seem to have this institutional fog that just seems to settle once those kind of, there's a brief clearing and political airing and those commitments are made and the public endorse that. And I think a lot of that, the fog machine is coming out of our institutions, and path dependency, and particularly in transport, the dominance of road-based thinking, car dependency. It's quite acute here.
Okay, do you want to pick that up? I mean, that's what elections about. Elections are about, isn't it? That there's a contest of ideas. People vote for them, and they expect implementation.
Yeah, I think just quickly on that point. I think the difference in what you're talking about there is they got voted in with a mandate that they went to the election with. At the moment, we have a number of key policies that have been raised that we weren't given the choice to vote in. For a start, for example, the Melbourne rail link. Now, whether it's better than Metro or not, this is the whole thing of this chopping and changing of ideas midway through political cycles in order to make a statement of difference. But on that issue of the $36 billion underspend in the outer areas, and I would suggest that it's a lot more that we're underspending in order to bring us up to where we need to be. Unfortunately, back to Andrew's point, we don't have $36 billion in the surplus budget area to actually spend. So the question is, how do we actually generate more funding in terms of things? And I can see your hand up again, and you're going to say, shall we take it from health? Shall we take it from education? Shall we take it from roads? The question is, there's only a certain amount of money out there, so how do you divvy it up evenly amongst everybody who needs it? One of the questions I will put to the people of this city is, are we actually prepared to make a contribution to push our own future forward in terms of indirect and direct user pays, in terms of benefited area levies, which we use for the Melbourne Underground Rail Loop, for example. So I'm not a person who sits here and says that this is just a job for government. I think it has to go much more broadly than that. I actually agree with Andrew. I think we should look at borrowing more against our very strong financial position, but you put under threat then your AAA rating, and that means more interest payments every year. And as the Premier has said, if we lose our AAA rating and go to AA+, that's the cost that we spend on education in this state every year. So it's not an easy thing to balance up, and we've all got quite simplistic ideas about how to do it, but I quite thankfully am not the one sitting there as the Treasurer of this state trying to balance what are very excessive demands with not enough money over this side to spend.
My understanding, I might be wrong, but from what Jennifer Keysmart said this morning was that they went to the election saying we are going to raise tax to pay for this investment. And that takes courage, I agree with you. But nevertheless, it was exactly the same what you said. It's saying, are we prepared to put our hands up, to put our money where our mouths are, basically, to achieve the outcomes that we think are important for the city?
Melbourne has very, very strongly raised that thing. The way we have to move forward is user pays, and everybody. That includes business who get value capture and uplift. There just isn't enough money in the tax bucket, and even if we increase taxes, we're still paying. So I'd much rather pay for something that I can see being built and know what it is than for something that I have, quite frankly, no idea where my money might be going.
Next question.
Hi, Tony Penner from the South Bank Residents Group. Andrew, I'd just like to say that I agree with you completely in regard to community collaboration and engagement. I do feel that Melbourne City Council acknowledges this as well, especially through the Participate Melbourne website. There are lots of examples that I've observed where the council does try to engage the community. The city road development for South Bank was probably one of those where there was several hundred responses on that website in regard to their plans, so to speak. So I think I acknowledge that, but I think the People's Pen also assisted that because of Melbourne in particular right, I would hate to lose focus of that. And then as we try to make this change, we actually drop something that we were doing really, really well because we didn't acknowledge it. So I'd like to ask everybody, maybe one thing that they think that we are actually doing right.
Who is we? Just as a...
We is in the City of Melbourne.
But at the City of Melbourne as in the council or the state government, or so the City of Melbourne as a...
Not the City of Melbourne as a municipality, but as a community in terms of this vision of the question of our big ideas. How do we achieve the big ideas? What is it that we're actually doing right? We don't want to let that go and then realise too late.
That's a great question, and it's the final question because I've got to come to Professor Ros Hanson in a moment, but I'll talk about that. But perhaps we could start with, at this end, Andrew, with one greatest hit each.
Well, the proof is in the pudding. Something must be working. We still got houses are being built. There's economic development. People are using roads. The trains are running. Yes, is it optimal? Probably not. Is it radically suboptimal? No. So it's working. It would be still working tomorrow. I think the one thing to keep is the balance. You need to keep the balance between good local discussions, keep it democratic as much as you can in terms of both the participatory and elected piece, have the oversight and the balancing with a state government focus. The checks and balances thing actually works.
Look, certainly from the perspective of my organisation, we get a lot of access and have a lot of interaction with ministers and shadow ministers, as well as with departmental secretaries. So I realise I'm in a bit of a different position to individuals who are sitting there in our ability to actually influence and have these discussions, but they are very welcoming, they are very willing to listen, and they want us to come and help them with ideas. So I think that is a great thing. What actually comes out at the end of the day in terms of, in governance is a process of actually winning an election, and at some point in time, rightly or wrongly by our opinion, they have to make some sort of differentiation. But I think they are, local councils, certainly the City of Melbourne and City of Port Phillip are both great members of ours, and they're very, very keen to engage and listen to what our membership have to say. So I think there is that willingness there. One of the questions that we have certainly in these sorts of forums is how, as individuals, are you able to be heard more? And we heard from the first question, how do you know you're actually getting the feedback and being listened to? It's a very difficult process, but I think we do have a great interaction regardless of what the particular policy come election time might be at the end. They are looking for solutions to problems.
Brendan.
One thing I think we have done very well, not so much just lately, but over the longer course, is to build ordinary urban fabric, and in particular the suburban fabric of Melbourne over a very long period of time. So Patrick Abercrombie, who's a great British planner, replanned London after World War II and advocate of strong planning and containment, when he came to Melbourne late 1940s, thought our suburbs were the best in the world. So I think we've been extremely good in a kind of unheralded and quiet way, and I think the long reign of the MMBW was part of that reason, but just in all sorts of myriad other ways in creating good ordinary urban fabric, and therefore, but everything for a time, and we need to undertake a big transition now to a more sustainable and resilient urban structure and form. But I think we do have to be a little less bellicose in blaming the people who are concerned about that change and accusing them of being NIMBYs and all that sort of thing. We ought to look to the complexity in this moment and understand that part of that sentiment is to say that we did produce something very good in Melbourne. We do, I think we recognise we need to change it, but we need to be very respectful and careful about how we do that.
As much as I might love public transport, I'm going to flip to the other side and say our road network, actually, our major road network. As somebody who remembers riding his bike down the Eastern Freeway before it was built, and the South Eastern Freeway finishing at Warrigal Road, to see the tunnel, the Balti Bridge, the Eastern Freeway link right around the top to the southeast and the Ring Road, that's pretty, for a big sprawling city, that's pretty remarkable. Building with all the difficulties you have in where you build the road and whose houses you're displacing and all the rest of it. So, as a basic network, I find it pretty extraordinary whenever but provided it's not peak hour, of course, because it's a bloody nightmare. But apart from that, I think it's amazing.
And people have Jeff Kennett to thank for a lot of that, and he probably should get the credit that he deserves at that level. I think it's a fantastic way to finish, because the whole point of the Future Melbourne Network is about making a great city greater. Could you please, in the time-honoured way, thank Andrew Hollows, Kate Roffey, Brendan Gleeson and Andrew Holden for their words tonight. Future Melbourne Network would like to again acknowledge and thank tonight's sponsors: Melbourne Conversations, Victorian Local Governance Association, Future Leaders, Fed Square, Melbourne Social Equity Institute and the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. Remember to leave your sticky notes, your post-it notes or your digital post-it notes on the website futuremelbournenetwork.org. futuremelbournenetwork.org. Finally, thank you very much for being here tonight, and thank you if you've been here for a series of nights. Professor Ros Hanson is one of the driving forces of the Future Melbourne Network. She knows a lot about planning. She was very, very much involved in producing some of the big ideas that have helped make this city great. Ros wants to talk about the future of the Future Melbourne Network. Good night to you all and go well.
Thanks, Michael, and I'll be passing some praise on to Michael later on. Many people have asked us, well, what now, what next? And that's a really legitimate question. Firstly, as Brendan said, we are intending to launch an ebook, which effectively will be a summary of not only what has been said in these 5 seminar sessions, but certainly collating and putting together the big ideas and the questions that people have been putting to us as part of their participation throughout the series of discussions. We're hoping that will be launched on the 10th of October, and if you haven't already left your email address with us, please do so before you leave tonight. We will email you and certainly let you know about the launch. And also it will be on our website, so please continue to click on our website. The second thing is that we are proposing to put some key questions to politicians in the lead up to this state election, and for our feedback from those politicians to be again put on the website. So we believe we've got some pretty important questions that need to be put to political candidates, and we intend to do that, embracing some of the themes that have been discussed over the last 5 seminars: housing, transport, climate change, etc., implementation tonight, funding and so on. So we intend to do that and be quite active in that space. We also will continue our engagement with the media throughout this time and endeavour as best as possible to put the big issues and the actions into the public arena through our contacts in the media, who to date have been very generous in their support. We are looking at galvanising strategic alliances with like-minded organisations and community-based groups. And if you are here tonight that you represent one of those organisations or groups, please come and talk to us. But we think that there is a bigger and better future for the future of Melbourne, and it will be done through collaboration and strategic participation. So we would encourage you to continue to be involved, and we do endeavour to do that post the state election and after this seminar series. So we're not dead yet. And we are looking for a bigger, brighter future for Melbourne. I have been absolutely astounded by the enthusiasm, the intellect, the ideas, and the sense of ownership that people have about this city. People are not fools. They know what they want, and they're telling us what they want. And we need more of that. We need more of people actually saying to our politicians, saying to our elected representatives, saying to the people who spend our taxes that we really do care and this is what we want. So some of the ideas and thoughts that were put forward today resonate very strongly with me, and I believe they do with our other members of the Future Melbourne Network. And in saying that, I'd like to invite the founding members who are here today of the Future Melbourne Network to join us on the stage. Would you please come down and join the speakers so that others can see it's a very diverse cross-section of people who have a genuine passion for this city. I'd like to finish with a very big thank you. And the first one goes to Michael Short, who has been absolutely fantastic. He is a stunningly savvy, smart man. Michael, would you come up? We have a small gesture of appreciation that we hope that you and your wife will enjoy, because I know that when he offered to do this pro bono, the great generosity, he said to me, oh, you know, my wife doesn't like me being out, you know, I've got the kids and home life. And I said, oh, look, I really understand that. But he was able to wrangle it so that he could be here and be our MC for each of these seminars. So this is our thank you to you and to your wife and your family, Michael, for your strong support and your generosity of time. The second thing is that we'd like to thank Danielle, who's our lady behind the AV, from Atticus Media. She's been absolutely terrific. This is the lady who edits all of this material and then puts it on YouTube and on our website for us. So thank you, Danielle, you've done a great job. I would also like to thank the Fed Square techies and staff, Russell and the crew. Again, a terrific team who've been very supportive of this seminar series, on the mark all the time with the slides, with the audio. So thank you very much, guys, and thank you, the Fed Square team. I'd like to thank our impressive lineup of thought-provoking and articulate speakers throughout this series on creating a better future for Melbourne. We have been very fortunate in having some of, I think, the best talent in this city in terms of the real thinkers who aren't afraid of change, who aren't afraid to speak out and be robust and forthright in their thinking. And I think we need people like that. We need more people like that to speak out and really drive this city to be more equitable, more fair, and more sustainable. So thank you to them as well, including tonight's speakers. And finally, I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of you who've attended these seminars. There are quite a number of faces in this room who've been to all 5 seminars. So that's a terrific feeling for us who've worked hard to put this together and with the assistance of our sponsors. And it wouldn't be a success if you weren't here. So thank you for attending. Thank you for your ideas on the postal notes that you've put as you've left, on Twitter, on our website. And let's face it, it's up to us to create a better future for Melbourne, and we're going to do it. Thank you.